Welcome to MUFON LA. My name is Steve Murillo, State Section Director for MUFON LA. We have a very interesting presentation lined up for you. Dr. Claude Swanson on the Synchronized universe. A new scientific revolution is underway. Recent discoveries in the hard sciences and parapsychology have demonstrated the existence of effects that our science cannot explain. These include dark matter, an unknown form making up most of the universe. Cold fusion. Present science says it's impossible, but it's being done every day and verified in 500 laboratories. Out-of-body and ESP phenomena, demonstrated using rigorous scientific methods. Dr. Swanson will discuss how science can evolve to explain these effects. In the process, we can begin to understand humanity's larger potential. We are more than our physical bodies. The spiritual component and the subtle energy component are real, as our science is beginning to now realize and prove. Perhaps that ETs have known this for a very long time. Dr. Claude Swanson is an MIT and Princeton educated physicist, specializing in the physics of the paranormal. His fieldwork has involved underwater archaeology, scientific measurements in haunted houses, remote viewing, psychokinesis, and new devices which can measure these strange forces. His book, The Synchronized Universe, New Science of the Paranormal, explores how science may be expanded to begin to account for these discoveries. Please give us a warm welcome for Dr. Claude Swanson.
Thank you. This is the book I've recently written summarizing some of the results so far. I have a lot of friends who have seen and experienced anomalous phenomena, and it's very difficult to hear those stories, especially when you know someone really well who's had some strange experiences, and conventional science says, well, it couldn't have happened because our science says it's impossible. Clearly, when you have enough experiences like that, you begin to realize that it's our science that needs to be upgraded, and it cannot progress by simply ignoring real things that happen in the universe. If we want a correct theory of physics and of science, we have to include all the phenomena, and science needs to enlarge itself and to grow up to include the phenomena that right now are being ignored. Next slide, please. When I was a young boy in Southern Virginia, I used to look up at the sky at night and look at all the stars. It was very clear then, and you feel like you can almost just raise your leg and step off the Earth into space. The stars seem so close. Another thing that I noticed, when you stand up and spin around at night, you see the stars above you spinning around, and at the same time you feel this force, centrifugal force, as your arms are raised from your sides, and when you stop spinning, the stars above you also stop and your hands fall by your side. And I was very intrigued by that phenomenon, and I wondered if there was some connection, if the distant matter, the stars spinning around, somehow caused that centrifugal force. That's not the current scientific view, but when I went to college at MIT, and my freshman physics course, we had a little bit of math by then, and we were studying the basics of elementary physics. And I knew enough to make some simple calculations to try to see if I could prove that that might be possible. I took the results to my teacher, Professor French, and he said, well, that's very interesting. Surely you must have heard about Mach's principle. And of course I had not, but Mach was a German philosopher, the last part of the 19th century, who really was the first person to create this idea that the distant matter may have some very important effect on the local forces that we feel. And if we really understood all the distant matter and the different ways that it can affect things locally, we would understand our physics at a deeper level. So that's been one of the motivations to me in my education. I went to Princeton for grad school and did my thesis research in Bob Dickey's gravity group. He's a Nobel Prize winner, invented the maser. And that group really studies the distant matter of the universe. And but I still found that all the courses I took did not satisfy me, that there was something missing. It seemed like there was something superficial about our present science. And it didn't seem like it was basing itself on really deep, intuitive ideas about how things ought to work. So I was working on my own ideas about the unified field theory, if you like, which is sort of the theory of the matter, the universe at the deepest possible level. And I have pursued that over the years, pretty much on the side, while I pursued a conventional career doing consulting work for various organizations over the decades. But I always kept in the back of my mind trying to understand what was missing, what would allow us to have a deeper understanding of the real universe. In the mid-'80s, I heard about remote viewing. I came across a couple of government scientists who told me about how Pat Price used to go into a light trance in a basement at SRI, and he could read documents halfway around the world. And that pretty much blew my mind. Obviously, nothing in our science can explain such a thing. It should be impossible. And I would have brushed it off, except I knew these people, and I knew that they weren't telling me the truth. So the thought occurred to me, maybe I'm missing something, that my education, that I'm overlooking some phenomena in the universe that really happen, and if I understand those things, then I can come to a better understanding myself of what the true unified field theory ought to look like, what our real science should be. So that kind of began the whole quest. Next slide, please. So that led me into the paranormal. So the connection with remote viewing led me to study the paranormal. My entire education up to that point had told me that the paranormal was just hoaxes and was all fake and all that. I had the conventional scientific education, and I believed what I'd been told by my teachers. And I realized looking back that the way our education system is structured, every student comes away with that kind of confidence in the conventional paradigm. The experiments that I was told to do by the professors in school were the experiments that confirmed what was in the textbook. So I felt like I had proven to myself that these theories are correct because, I just did the experiment, I got the same results. Looking back, I realized all the other experiments that I might have done, that I would have gotten a very different result. No one ever said go to a haunted house and measure magnetic fields there. I would have found that some new theory was needed if I'd done that. So what is the connection between the paranormal and UFOs? Next slide, please. Here are just a few examples of why there seems to be an overlap or a parallelism between paranormal phenomena and UFO technology. On the left is levitation by a craft. On the right is levitation by a priest. This is Brother Joseph, who lived in the Middle Ages, and he had this bad habit. He would go to church and start singing and get very excited and very ecstatic, and he'd begin rising up out of the pulpit and float around in the church. And his brothers became disturbed. It was very distracting to them. They made him sit at the back, and he was eventually canonized by the church. They did a very careful, very careful investigation and concluded, yes, he was real. Others have had the same ability. Now, next slide, please. Another area is OBEs, the out-of-body experience. In the paranormal, this has been studied for many decades. On the top is the Landau OBE case. A man and wife did this experiment. His wife, Mr. Landau's wife, had this habit when she was asleep that she would go out of body and she'd wander around the house. And she had a lot of conscious control while she was out of body. So he arranged this experiment. He asked her to. He asked her to bring, he left his address book in her room, and he asked her to carry it across the hall at night while she was OBE to see if she could really carry things. So this is a sketch. What happened was she tried to lift up the address book and her hand went right through it. So she couldn't bring it, and she thought afterwards that maybe it was because it was his book and she wasn't supposed to touch other people's property. So she found a small toy dog in her room and carried it across the hall. And this sketch is done right at the moment she's left the dog by his bed, and she's backing out of the room, kind of sliding or gliding backwards into her room. Her body is across the hall in the bed, but her OBE body was visible to Mr. Landau, who's lying in bed. OBEs, of course, occur a lot, or reported a lot, in abduction cases. The bottom one is a sketch by Betty Andreas and Luca. Her physical body is lying on the sofa. Her OBE body is standing up as she's led away for an abduction experience on board a craft. Next slide, please. Orbs are another phenomena that are reported both in UFOs and in paranormal phenomena. The top is a drawing by Betty Andreas and Luca of some orbs that accompanied an abduction encounter. The bottom is a photograph taken by a friend of mine at a camp out from a bunch of my friends who have a lot of anomalous experiences. We were trying to photograph orbs and had spent the night in a graveyard where we'd seen orbs by eye. When you have a flashlight go off very bright, a flash lamp from a camera in a graveyard, you can oftentimes see orbs over the graves, but we didn't get any good pictures. We came back and felt kind of discouraged. 3 days later, this image showed up. A 12-year-old girl in our group had taken it in front of the cabin where they were staying, and you can see it's about 3 feet in diameter, and you can see the front post of the front porch through the orb, and the reflections around the orb correspond to the sky and the trees. So it's really it's an amazing picture. Next slide, please. I was part owner of a very haunted house in West Virginia, where a lot of paranormal phenomena were seen. This is a nighttime shot from outside. The top very bright line, we believe, is an orb that was moving rapidly during the flash photograph. There are quite a few shots like this that came out. Initially, I was pretty skeptical about all kinds of, lens flares and other artifacts, but I've had enough experiences now with orbs that I'm quite convinced that they're real, and they probably, are just one more example of technology and phenomena that our science can't explain right now, but we need to address. Next slide, please. The path of the soul is another theme that shows up in UFO abductions very often. The bottom drawing is another Betty Andreas and Luca drawing. This is these light beings, these faceless beings that are oftentimes reported in her experiences. They seem to be kind of our soul bodies, if you like. They're not physical, but they go through these trainings and these various experiences that she describes in the books that Raymond Fowler has written about her experiences. The top drawing depicts Daniel Brinkley's near-death experience. In his there are thousands and thousands of people who've had near-death experiences, and they almost universally report encounters with various light beings. In this case, these different light beings are showing him images of the future. Next slide, please. The tunnel is one more phenomenon that crosses the boundary between the paranormal and ET UFO experiences. In many abductions, people report tunnels opening up in the wall where beings crawl out of, things like that. In near-death experiences, a tunnel opens up, and the people, or our souls, or whatever you want to call them, that lift out of the body in a near-death experience, go through a tunnel into the other side where they meet dead relatives, light beings, etc. The tunnel is a very old phenomenon. Here, this is a Hieronymus Bosch painting from several hundred years ago showing angelic beings inside the tunnel. So this is a very widely observed phenomenon, and you might want to think of it as some kind of connection or gateway between different dimensions, but whatever it is, it's seen in different in both these areas. Next slide, please. The Faraday cage. Here's a interesting little sidelight on the out-of-body experience. Robert Monroe was one of the pioneers of the out-of-body experience in America. He created the Monroe Institute and the Hemisync tapes that are very good at putting you in a very relaxed state where people can have out-of-body experiences. He used to do it a lot, and he had a special room, a little cage, if you like, with waterbed and very quiet environment at the Monroe Institute. He would go out of body. And this cage had a Faraday cage around it, basically a wire mesh, which shields out the electric fields and magnetic fields. So it made a very nice environment for OBE experiments, and he had no trouble going out of body. He would go right through the cage. But one time he tried charging up the wires to 50,000 volts. And when he did that, and he tried to go through, his OBE body got caught in the wires, and they were like he was unable to get out of the cage. It was a trap for him. So it tells us something about the astral body or the out-of-body form. There's some physics that are implied by this observation. Other experts at out-of-body, like Scott Rogo and Keith Harari, have reported similar phenomena. And if you go back to the Ghostbusters movie, you remember that the ghost trap they used was a Faraday cage, a little box that they charge up to a high voltage, and once they got the ghost in there, it could not get out. So it seems like Dan Aykroyd may have known about the same technology. And there's also Bill Cooper's story about some of the first ETs that were captured in the early 50s. He said that they put them in a Faraday cage, and it may be he was referring to something like this. Next slide, please. Stephen Greer has talked about a credible witness who was doing going out of body, for his own practice, if you like, and he went up through the atmosphere in his out of body form, and he collided with a UFO. And the UFO was supposed to be in the astral form as well, and he said that when this happened, the ETs in the craft knew about his encounter, and Greer speculates that the ETs use astral technology. They understand. For us, this is sort of a quasi-fictional realm. We don't really understand very much about it, but the ETs may have mastered the energies and be able to engineer propulsion in this realm. Next slide, please. Time travel and prophecy is another area where we have overlap between the paranormal phenomena and UFO technology. There are lots of reports in abduction cases or contactee cases of UFOs able to travel in time. Some people believe that ETs here today may be travelers from the future. Mark Davenport wrote a very nice book about the summarizing many of the time-traveling cases involving UFOs. Billy Meyer's encounters with his ETs also describe many time-traveling examples. There's a Brazilian abductee, among many, many cases. I'm sure you know more than I do about but one abductee, for example, who was missing for a few hours and came back with 5 days growth of beard and remembered 5 days on the craft, but he'd only been gone a few hours. So this ability to control time and to alter time is one of the mysterious aspects. In the paranormal, psychics also are able to move in time and describe how this is done. Next slide, please. Here's one example where contactees often bring back information about technology, and this information crosses the border between the paranormal and UFOs and our present science. And this is one case that I found very interesting because to me it was meaningful. It was helpful in understanding how they may think about it and helping us to catch up, maybe to understand better what the science looks like from their perspective. This is in Charlotte McLean's book, Out on a Limb, and there's a Pleiadian described in that book named Mayan, a woman who said something. Here's some direct quotes from her description. There's a force at work in the atom which acts as the cohesive element, the organizer of all matter. And she describes it as gluons, as the basic nuclear force that holds particles in the nucleus together, but also says there's a long-range component of this force, which is the key to their technology. Next slide, please. This long-range part of the force is what makes up the soul. It's sort of the key ingredient for a lot of the paranormal phenomena that we don't understand. That the soul is a physical force, but it's different. It's a different kind of force from the physical atoms and the molecular forces that comprise the body. It's a subatomic force. It's the intelligent energy that organizes life. And when I read over some of this, it reminded me also of how Bob Lazar talks about the gravity A and the gravity B forces. There's two different kinds of gravity. So there's lots of overlap, and whether you believe information like this or not, we're not in a position yet to really make a final judgment, but it's certainly suggestive, and it shows that there are these overlaps between the two fields. Next slide, please. So paranormal phenomena may offer an inexpensive and easily available laboratory for studying UFO technology. If you look at the haunted house photographs that I described earlier, these orbs that move around rapidly, Also have magnetic anomalies. They have optical anomalies. They have electrical field effects that are unexplainable by current science. And it looks to me as though there may be some connection between those phenomena and UFO propulsion technology. Next slide, please. When you look at all the different ways that our present science is being violated, the present paradigm is being violated by some of these phenomena, it leads me to the conclusion that a new revolution is underway. Next slide, please. Many things occur in our universe that science cannot explain. Next slide. Let's go over some of the things in the hard sciences that suggest that the paradigm is broken. What's the evidence? Next slide, please. Dark matter is one example. This is a photograph, or it's a computer-generated image of a portion of the sky. The red part is the dark matter. It's the part that does not fit with our present scientific models. The blue dots, which are almost invisible in this picture, are the known, understandable stars and galaxies. The dark matter and dark energy make up more than 95% of the universe. And at the present time, our science cannot tell us what this is made of. It may be new particles that are not in our present theory. Next slide. The law of gravity is also not obeying the textbook descriptions of Newton and Einstein. If you study the basic theory of gravity, the way it's supposed to work, a solar eclipse is not going to affect a pendulum. But this graph shows the behavior of the Foucault pendulums, these very long string pendulums that oscillate very slowly. And as the Earth rotates, the axis of the pendulum will slowly change through the day. There's one in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, for example. But unfortunately, what happens is that when a solar eclipse occurs, the rate of change of angle does a blip. It veers off into a strange direction that's not explained by present theory. This has been verified by several experiments. Our present physics is pretty much ignoring these experiments, but they appear to be real. So the law of gravity is not working the way it's supposed to. Next slide, please. Cold fusion is one more area. Although it's been ridiculed in the mainstream press, there are 500 laboratories around the world that have duplicated many aspects of this experiment. Recently, the U.S. Navy did a study that verified cold fusion is real. EPRI, the Electrical Power Research Institute, which is the think tank for the utilities, electrical power companies in this country, spent $10 million duplicating cold fusion and concluded that it's a real phenomenon and should be developed. Next slide, please. Now, our science can't understand these things, unfortunately. I mean, we don't know how they work. We can't explain why they work, but they definitely do work. So they're challenges to the current paradigm. One more is charge clusters. Electrons are tiny little particles that have a charge, and like charges are supposed to repel each other. So if you put 10 billion negative charges together, they should go flying apart at an enormous rate. But what we find is they don't. They stick together. If you put them together in a small enough ball, the size of the point of a pin, they stick together. They cluster. And this has been shown from making these things in little spark chambers where you create a spark. And the spark does not fly apart. It hangs together. And there's actually been inventions and technologies developed from this. The lower picture here is what happens when these charge clusters hit a metal plate at the other side. Each little cluster of 10 billion electrons or so drills a hole into the metal. Next slide, please. The top picture here is a hole that's drilled by a charge cluster into aluminum sheet. When this happens, they not only do they stick together and they drill into metal, but they also create fusion. They create cold fusion in the metal. The lower picture is a graph showing the before and after of the elements present in the aluminum. Before, it was pure aluminum. Afterwards, there are a bunch of different other elements, chromium and nickel and copper and iron, that are created by the impact of the charge cluster. So it's making fusion occur, nuclear fusion in the metal, which is not, defies current science, but it's happening. Next slide, please. In cosmology, also, there are anomalies that are being ignored by mainstream science, but they're really serious. In this picture, there's a nearby galaxy, and there are 3 quasars. Quasars, are these supposed to be very, very distant objects, all the way almost to the far end of our universe. They're supposed to be very massive, very powerful concentrations of energy. Unfortunately, they're all connected to this nearby galaxy by little streamers of gas, which suggests that quasars are not far away. They're actually much closer. And a famous astronomer, Halton Arp, has pointed this out to the community, and the community has responded by not allowing him to publish his papers about this subject. So it's just one of many, many areas like this where there are these glaring anomalies that say something is missing here, folks. Next slide, please. The speed of light has been broken. Light travels faster than light in some cases. In one set of experiments by a Berkeley professor of physics, Raymond Chow, he found that if you make light pass through barriers called tunneling barriers, they travel faster than light in the tunneling barrier. They travel at virtually infinite speeds in tunneling barriers. Next slide, please. Electrical free energy. This is a drawing from a patent that was approved and granted to a Japanese inventor named Kawai. In the text of the patent, they describe experiments done with this generator in which they get out 3 times the energy that they put in. So they're making free energy, and this is a patent that was approved by the patent office. They didn't approve it on the basis of it being a free energy device, but they just happened to mention in the text that it is a free energy device. Again, our law of conservation of energy is being violated here. Our science needs to be able to explain how these things work. Next slide, please. Even stranger, a Russian astronomer named Nikolai Kozyrev has conducted a remarkable series of experiments where he's able to change the rate of time flow. He actually talks about the density of time, and it's a very complicated series of experiments he's done, but the bottom line is that he shows that time has a structure to it. You can do certain things that change the rate of it, either speed it up or slow it down. And you can take that changing time and radiate it like light and bounce it around in mirrors and concentrate it. In the left, this represents a elliptical mirror, like a egg-shaped mirrored wall, and it has 2 focal points. On the left-hand focal point, there's some chemical process. It could be evaporation or anything that might change the entropy or change the evaporation of some physical process. What he finds is you take the energy from that process and refocus it on the right-hand side on maybe a piece of metal or in a glass of water or something, and masses will change, densities will change. Things that our science says should not be changing can be altered in these processes. It opens up a whole new area that might give us some clues to time travel. Next slide, please. One more area is levitation technology. The top figure is a Japanese experiment published in Physical Review Letters, very prestigious, in fact, one of the most prestigious journals in the world in physics. 2 Japanese scientists took a gyroscope, spun it very fast, and found out that if you spin it in one direction, its weight does not change. If you spin it in the other direction, its weight does change, and it decreases. And the faster you spin it, the less it weighs. So it's basically levitating or beginning to start to levitate. It's very small changes, but they're real, and they're proportional to speed. So this is something that flies in the face of present science. On the bottom is a photograph of one of Victor Schauberger's craft that the Germans used as their model for some of their levitation experiments with saucers in the late 30s. Schauberger used water in certain circulating patterns. He was able to show that in certain circulating patterns you get free energy, that the water, the more it circulates, moves faster and faster and faster, and also develops levitation properties. And this has been well demonstrated, and yet it still totally flies in the face of science. Next slide, please. So that's just the hard sciences. What about the paranormal? What's the evidence there? Next slide. Remote viewing is one of the best established areas of paranormal phenomena. Now, in the early 70s, the U.S. government funded a remote viewing program that was started in secret by the CIA continued for 20 years. Fortunately for us, it became public and disbanded in the early 90s, and so now all those remote viewers have gone to teaching others, so many people now have become remote viewers. I took a course in remote viewing in '96. One of the nice things about remote viewing is that even if you're not very psychic, even if you're like a left-brain scientist like me and you're used to trying to analyze or overanalyze everything, remote viewing is perfect for you because it gives you a structure that keeps your left brain busy. Every thought that comes up, that pops into your head, your left brain, your analytical part has to analyze it and put it into a chart or something, and that gives your right brain or your subconscious mind, your intuitive mind, the freedom to come up with more ideas. And as the session proceeds in this structured way, you get more and more in tune with the target. You know, you're never given what the target is. You're always told it's just some set of numbers somewhere, so you have no idea consciously what it is. Here's an example from where the target was the destruction of Pompeii, by the volcano in Roman times. And what I got was, Spanish-style house with a fountain. I saw something that looked like the old Roman houses. The idea of Exodus, the Red Sea, flurry of activity. Even the name Pompeii, destruction of Pompeii, came up for me. And the drawing shows Roman soldiers building a barricade, while in the distance there is light in the sky, something bright. There's dark smoke around it, and I wrote in, it's making me cry, and I felt fear and urgency and the crowd and all those things. So even though I wasn't sure exactly where I was, I got all the feelings of being there. And that this is a drawing that actually was done during the session. I added the color later to make it easier to understand. But if you take remote viewing courses, you realize that we really do go to these places. We experience the events as though they're happening right now. And that flies in the face of our concepts of space and time. Next slide, please. For the great remote viewers, it's much easier. It's like sailing the Caribbean on a clear day. This is a photograph of Pat Price, one of the first remote viewers from the military program, in the center. Hal Puthoff is a physicist who's been very active in this area on the right, who created that original program. Anyway, just amazing feats if you go back to what Pat Price did during that program, one of the greatest remote viewers around. Next slide, please. When that program fell apart in the early 90s, the CIA made an effort to make it appear as though they were abandoning it because it didn't work. In fact, one of the remote viewers was writing a screenplay and a book and planning to go public, even though he was a military officer at the time. So the CIA realized they had to get rid of the program or else they would be embarrassed. So they hired an organization called the AIR to try to debunk the entire program as a way to save face. However, one of the people on that panel, Dr. Jessica Utz, wrote a review of the program, and she said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. The statistical results of the studies examined are far beyond what is expected by chance. And she's a professor at the University of California. Next slide, please. The strange thing about remote viewing is that the accuracy does not weaken with distance. Here's data on remote viewing scores from virtually zero distance up to 6,000 miles, and they found that the accuracy, there's no drop-off with distance. Next slide, please. Also with time, if you're remote viewing targets that are in the future or in the past, it does not matter. Your accuracy is independent of the time offset. Next slide, please. Dr. Robert John, the head of the PEAR Lab, who created the PEAR Lab at Princeton, one of the leading laboratories that's done research in this area, says all forces known to physics, like gravity, for example, diminish with distance. And no force in physics operates freely across time like this. It's as if consciousness is somehow able to direct its influence directly across space and time, an understanding that certainly poses a challenge for science. Next slide, please. And here's a graph from ESP experiments that the Princeton PEAR Lab has done. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments that they've summarized here on this one graph. And on the average, for average psychics, average viewers, you get a bell-shaped curve. Because by and large, for most people, we're not very psychic. We're not very good at doing this. And so the data looks pretty average. However, there tends to be a hump on the upper side of the bell-shaped curve, that there's more accurate data than there is inaccurate data. And when you subtract the real data from the random expectation, you get this residue, the red curve, which shows that on the average, there's more accuracy, even for normal, off-the-street average people. So there's a real effect in ESP and psychic phenomena. Next slide, please. One of the longest distance ESP experiments ever done was by the astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. On the way back from the moon, he unwrapped some papers he had hidden in his belongings in the spacecraft, and began doing a long-distance ESP experiment with 4 psychics on the Earth, 200,000 miles away. And they found the results there far exceeded what's expected by chance, and they published a paper on this when they got back. So it shows that again, the distance and time don't weaken this phenomena. He's been one of the pioneers, one of the very active people in promoting research into this area. Next slide, please. This is a slide by Dr. Dean Radin summarizing various kinds of psychic experiments, 9 different areas of psychic experiments over all the data basically that's been published, summarizing it all and finding very large deviations from chance. And there's definitely real effects here. Next slide, please. One of the fascinating aspects of psychic phenomena is that our subconscious mind seems to be a very good receiver. Our subconscious mind knows when we get psychic information, but our conscious mind, for the average person, does not know. These are based on brainwave patterns. The top pattern is the brainwave response when you hear a tone, a 2,000 hertz tone. Your brainwave responds, your brain responds saying, yes, I hear a tone. I recognize information there. And so it gives a certain characteristic response. The lower curve shows the brain pattern when a psychic message is sent to the same person. When the psychic message is received, the brain shows a characteristic response saying, yes, I'm getting the psychic message. But if you ask the person afterwards, did you get it? He says, no, I didn't get anything. The conscious mind is not in touch with the subconscious for most people. So even though our brain knows it, the higher conscious part does not. That's where meditation comes in. That's where a lot of these brain quieting practices seem to be very effective at teaching us how to get that analytical part out of the way so we can recognize when the psychic message comes through. Next slide, please. The conclusion is that ESP reception is widespread, but often poor communication between the subconscious mind and the conscious mind. Next slide, please. We find that these phenomena are much more accurate at certain times of day. Over hundreds of thousands of cases of remote viewing and psychic sending and transmission experiments were summarized in this graph to see what time of day or time of month or when's the best time to be most accurate as a psychic. And what they found is that what matters the most is where the stars are in the sky, the sidereal time. 13.5 hours sidereal, you get that huge peak in the middle where the accuracy for remote viewing and ESP reception is the highest. It's about 4 times more accurate at that time. And that's roughly the time where an area called the Great Attractor is opposite the Earth at that time. And it's been theorized that maybe there's a noise source there that interferes with psychic reception. But the data shows that something, there's a mechanism, there's something important about this data that we need to take a look at. Next slide, please. The Princeton Pear Lab has shown in hundreds of thousands of experiments that people are also able to influence at a distance. We can send our mind out and affect mechanical objects and electrical objects thousands of miles away. This is the random event generator that the Princeton Pear Lab began using back in the late 70s. It's a bunch of balls, like a big pinball machine. The balls fall down, hit metal posts and pile up at the bottom in a Gaussian-shaped, bell-shaped curve. But when you focus on this device with your intention, you can make the balls fall to the right or fall to the left. And they find that you're able to do this not just in the laboratory, but even thousands of miles away, far beyond chance. Nowadays, what's more widely used are called random event generators that are all electrical, just using electrical quantum noise, and they're able to do the same thing. Next slide, please. This is just a graph from the Princeton group showing how when you want the results to go high, they go high. When you want them to go low, they go low. And when you're not trying at all, they stay in the middle. Next slide, please. One of the early experiments that shows how our mind is able to affect things was done by Ingo Swann at Stanford. There was a device in the basement of the physics department that was designed to detect quarks. It was a very heavily shielded device, had these layers of superconducting metals and all kinds of things to keep out any disturbances from anything at all. And Hal Puthoff asked Ingo to try with his mind to go out of body and go into this device and describe what he saw there and see if he could affect it. And as Ingo did that, he described what the device looked like inside, and as he would focus on each aspect of the device, he got different kinds of disturbances. Normally the device would make a nice clean sinusoidal curve, but whenever Ingo focused on some aspect of the device, the curve sped up by a factor of 2 or more. This has never been seen before from any other type of disturbance. Next slide, please. Precognition is one more area, which is basically looking into the future. So again, jumping over time. Dean Radin did experiments where people are shown images. A couple of seconds before they're shown the image, they have a physiological response as if they know what that image is going to be. It's going to be a happy image, a bad image, a disturbing image, an exciting image, etc. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting types of experiments that has been done is out-of-body experiments where near the target certain sensors are set up to see if you can detect an energy form near the target. So here a remote viewer is in some other room, and the target he wants to go look at is in this particular room shown in the drawing. There's a box there, and in the box is some image, and the remote viewer is trying to go there to look at the image and describe it. They found that when he's accurate at describing what's in the image, that sensors at that location pick up disturbances. There's some energy form that we don't understand that's present at those times. Strain gauges are upset. Strain gauges that are showing the metal plates in that area are being disturbed by something. Optical sensors, all kinds of disturbances are showing up. Next slide, please. Another way of measuring out-of-body, a lot of people report that cats can see things that we can't. Keith Harari was a very gifted psychic who could go out of body easily. He had a pet kitten who was very fond of him. They put the pet kitten in a box with a floor that had little squares marked off on it, and they counted the number of meows per minute and the number of squares the kitten crossed per minute. During the lower graph shows the number of I think that's the meows per minute. On the left-hand bar is a huge red bar that shows the average number of meows per minute the kitten was making. But when Harari went out of body and tried to go to visit the kitten to comfort it, the right-hand bar, which is almost invisible there, shows the number of meows per minute. The cat got quiet when Harari, who was in another building, hundreds of yards away, was trying to come and visit the kitten. So the kitten somehow knew that he was present. Next slide, please. This is an example that shows that this stuff all may be new to us. It may be very controversial but in ancient cultures, a lot of this knowledge is part of their education. This is a description by an Australian Aborigine of how he hunts. Yes, I come out of my humpy, my shelter, in the morning, knowing my family needs food. I stand silently with my arms at my sides, with my eyes closed, and slowly turn clockwise 3 times. This releases the real me from the physical body. and I move upward into the no time. I see where the wallaby or the kangaroo is, and I also observe where it will be when I take my physical body there. I return to my body and go where the game will be, and of course it is there. I ask its forgiveness, and then I kill it, and we have food. So we've clearly forgotten a few things, and it's pretty useful if you can do time travel like this. Next slide, please. This is a photograph taken on the back porch of a house I used to own part of in West Virginia. It was a very haunted house. This picture was taken in the backyard at night, facing the back porch, which is lit and is open, and there's no one standing there. It appears to be a vortex that's made visible. On the left-hand side, you can see horizontal lines, which are the clapboards of the back wall of the house. And in the area of the vortex, the clapboard lines are bent upwards, as though the light is being distorted from them. The right-hand side is dark, and we think that that's maybe the darkness, because the night, all around the house, it was at nighttime, it was very dark. So it's as though the vortex is made visible by bending of light, which should be impossible by our present science, but somehow these phenomena do show up in haunted areas. Next slide, please. Group consciousness is one more area where the paranormal effects are seen when many, many people are focusing on a single thought. Random event generators, which measure quantum noise, no longer behave randomly. They become coupled together. And this has been proved now in thousands of experiments. Next slide, please. This is one example, the OJ trial. You have lots and lots of people focusing on one single thing, and this doesn't have to be, peace on earth necessarily. Here they're just focusing on watching the key events of the television, the pre-show beginning, and then the time when the verdict was announced. And at those times, the Nielsen ratings showed that the audience worldwide was the largest. And at those times, random event generators around the world became coupled to odds against chance, ranging from hundreds to thousands of odds against chance. So a very anomalous behavior when many people focus on a single thought. Next slide, please. This shows two photographs taken simultaneously by two cameras. The cameras were identical, but the right camera had been touched and handled by a person who has some kind of anomalous energy, which for a better word, would just call psychic energy. He had trouble with cameras, and in the right-hand picture, if you look closely, there are double images, there are distorted images, there are strange smears that in the photograph that can't be explained, and this was duplicated by Dr. William Tiller in many experiments, so that paranormal effects can apparently cause light to behave in anomalous ways. Next slide, please. This is a drawing from the Chinese teleportation experiments. The Chinese did a survey of their billion-plus population to find the most psychic people. They found people like Zhang, who was very gifted at teleportation. He became famous in China for his ability. On one occasion, before a large number of witnesses, he caused a 100-pound sack of sugar to move through walls of a storehouse, ending up in front of a crowd of people. The drawing itself depicts an experiment that I have 4 people who have seen in China, where one person will have a roll of film in a canister in his pocket, and he'll cause it to be teleported through a wall to another person. They also take a small radio transmitter and teleport it in a similar way. When they teleport the radio transmitter, the frequency drops to 0 at the moment of teleportation. When it comes back up from 0, it comes up in the new location. Next slide, please. Uri Geller has also done teleportation under the watchful eye of scientists in London, and this was reported by the National Research Council. He caused a crystal in a container to disappear, to move through the walls of the container. Next slide, please. Kundalini is one more area where phenomena are observed that we cannot explain. Kundalini is considered in the whole element of spiritual development as you begin mastering the subtle energies that make up the body. Kundalini may represent a synchronization of the different energy forms. And this just shows an anomalous voltage shift that occurred during an experiment that can't be explained by the electronics that was present. The next slide, please. Throughout history, in many older societies, there were schools to teach people how to master these abilities. Nowadays, we have controversy whether they exist at all or not, but in ancient times, the mystery schools, by various names, taught people how to master the paranormal abilities. In the yogis in India were just one example of a group that learned how to do this. The lower graph in this picture shows Swami Rama, an Indian yogi, who demonstrated the physical control that he was able to of his body. He took two temperature sensors attached to the hand, only 2 inches apart on the palm of the hand, and he could cause one to rise and one to drop in temperature by up to 5 or 6 degrees. In this case, one temperature went up by 5 and one went down by 6 at the same time, all by conscious control. He could cause his heart to fibrillate or to stop altogether, and a variety of other phenomena that we don't know how they do it, but it's just one example of the types of control that adepts are able to master. Next slide, please. In ancient times, here's one example of a adept who was famous in Rome during the same time as Jesus. He was born in about 15 A.D., and his records were preserved by the Roman governors of the time. He was known to the high Roman officials, and they have court records about him. One of the early Christian church fathers wrote the following. "How is it," he said, "that the talismans of Apollonius have power in certain members of creation? For they prevent, as we see, the fury of the waves, and the violence of the winds, and the attacks of wild beasts. And whilst our Lord's miracles are preserved in tradition alone, those of Apollonius are most numerous, and actually manifested in present facts, so as to lead astray all beholders." And they tried to take Apollonius to court trial a couple times in Rome. And one time, when they opened up the scroll that had his crimes on it, they found that all the words had disappeared from the scroll. So, next slide, please. So, adepts reveal the power of consciousness. This is, I think, the new frontier that we're faced with, and it may require our science to rethink its old ways of approaching problems, where the experimenter becomes the experiment. Where it's more than just the quantum effect of the observer affecting the experiment. You may really totally change the experiment in ways that we don't really understand. But Sri Yukteswar, one of the great yogis who supported the idea that we need to bring consciousness into science, says all creation is governed by law. The principles that operate in the outer universe, discoverable by science, are called natural laws, and that's our physics. But there are subtler laws that rule the hidden spiritual planes and the inner realm of consciousness. These principles are knowable through the science of yoga. It's not the physicist, but the self-realized master who comprehends the true nature of matter. By such knowledge, Christ was able to restore the serpent's ear after it had been severed by one of the disciples. Now, it may be that some of the knowledge of consciousness and of this new science is exactly what UFOs are trying to also teach us, and why we have so much trouble understanding some of the things that we see, all the outer body and all of the strange effects that go on in abduction cases. It may be that it's because the rules are so different from what we're used to. Next slide, please. So I just list here 14 areas in both hard sciences and paranormal where we're getting real breakdown of the present conventional wisdom and real anomalies that need to be addressed in the new science. Next slide, please. So paranormal and UFO evidence both support the existence of other dimensions, the reality of astral phenomena, the power of consciousness, and new forces that defy the rules of space and time. Next slide, please. So we need a new theory. I mean, the old theories just don't work at all, and science has to face that. Next slide, please. What I'm going to talk about now are some ideas that are in my book about how our science can change to begin to try to understand these phenomena. And it's only a beginning. Next slide, please. And just to let you know that I understand how difficult this is, here's a couple of quotes from Einstein. "Whoever undertakes to set himself up as a judge in the field of truth and knowledge is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods." And also, if we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? Next slide, please. What I love about Einstein is he reasoned, he thought by intuition. His intuition came first. He had a picture of the universe, and that's what guided him. The math came later. Nowadays, a lot of times our physics is dominated by people for whom the math comes first. And when they finish the math, they still don't understand in an intuitive way what they're describing. And that's one of the problems that superstrings has been having, is trying to understand the physical interpretation. But Einstein, for him, the idea came first. His special relativity was birthed one day when he imagined what it would be like to ride a beam of light, to ride a photon or a beam of light and travel at the speed of light. And then he looked out over the landscape and imagined what the universe would look like from that perspective. And that's what led him to create his special relativity theory. Next slide, please. Another one of my heroes is Richard Feynman, who died a few years ago, but created a lot of our modern physics. And he would think about the electron in the same way. The electron travels forward and backward in space and in time over very small distances. And that was one of Feynman's great insights. When he realized that, he was able to come up with a mathematics that was much simpler than the existing mathematics, and got the Nobel Prize for it. And this is a little picture just to show the horizontal axis is space, the upward or the vertical axis is time, and the red line with the arrows kind of shows how an electron moves in a random zigzag pattern in space and in time. On the average, it goes up, it goes forward in time, but it goes backwards some of the times. Next slide, please. The existing model for physics at the small level is shown in the upper picture here. This is what's called QED in this kind of the conventional science, which says that as an electron moves along, that red line is an electron, it has a random chance every so often of emitting or absorbing a particle of light. And the particle of light is called a photon. When that happens, the electron will make a little zig or a little zag, and that's what makes the uncertainty principle. That's what makes it hard to predict where it's going to be, because there's uncertainty there. A newer theory has been proposed called SED by Hal Puthoff and other people who were interested in psychic phenomena, and their idea is that that space is filled with lots and lots of photons, lots and lots of particles of light all moving around randomly, and that's called the zero-point energy. And every so often it'll hit an electron and cause it to veer off, and when it does, that causes the uncertainty. But now you have real photons to deal with, and now you can begin to explain some of the paranormal things that you couldn't before. Next slide, please. My contribution, which I hope is what it is it's called the Synchronized universe model, and it just takes the next step. It says these photons that are out there, these particles of light in the vacuum of space, the zero-point energy, must be connected to something. They must have gotten created somewhere, and they must get absorbed somewhere else. Well, that's the distant matter. So this picture shows a local electron in the center of the picture. That's the red line in the middle. That's some nearby particle. And then the blue stuff at the edges, that's all the distant matter. And there's a lot more of that than there is local stuff. And so the idea is it's all connected. And if you really could see where things come from and where they go, you'd understand that it's not, and we're not alone, we're not independent, we're coupled together. There's an intimate coupling between things that are local and things that are far away. Next slide, please. This idea was originally proposed by Richard Feynman and others back in the 40s, and he also added the extra idea that light can travel backwards in time. That light from the distant matter can travel backwards in time from the future and arrive here at the present and affect us. And when you put that idea together with the other ideas, then that makes things that happen locally coupled with things that are far away in a very intimate way, so that we're really affecting each other. There's a coupling that's very important between things that are nearby and far away. Next picture, please. Next slide. Thank you. So this model basically is set up so it does not violate what we know about current science, and yet it gives us a way to couple things together across the entire universe. This is Mach's principle that I mentioned earlier, and this is a way to kind of put it into current science. Next slide, please. This just shows that when you allow a photon or a particle of light to go forward away from you into the future, so that maybe 10 billion years from now it's absorbed by something far away, and then that thing can radiate and send back to you that same particle of light backwards in time, and then arrives back locally here. The two photons, one going forward in time, one backward in time, couple together and allow you to say that the motions that are nearby are affecting things that are far away, and vice versa. Next slide, please. I know this may sound strange, and it may sound like it has very little to do with UFOs or paranormal or anything else, but if you think about it, what I'm describing are things that are very, very far away from each other that are coupled together. Things that have very large time differences between them that are coupled together. So what we have here are things that start to sound a lot like paranormal phenomena. One more part of the puzzle is the idea that if you allow things to travel backwards and forwards in time, then the distant matter in the future, where all the things get absorbed, we can draw that here in this picture by the upper oval, the upper blue oval. That's the celestial sphere of distant matter in the future. The celestial sphere we look out and see at night from all the stars in the past is the other blue oval at the bottom. So at any given moment you're interacting with both sets of matter, the matter in the future and the matter in the past. Whatever's happening here in the present is really a coupling together with all the matter in the future and in the past. Next slide, please. A key idea to making this work, and I'll try to move along very quickly here because I don't know how much interest you really have with the details of the physics, and I don't want to bore people with that. But the basic idea is that at the very smallest levels, the electron, if you could see it with a very, very powerful microscope, it would look like it has no mass, and it zips along at the speed of light, and at the very smallest scales that our science can imagine. And when it does this, and it emits a particle of light, a photon, it basically does it straight ahead. It's like a motorcycle with a headlight. The headlight always points in the direction that front wheel is going, so that when you emit light, it travels in the direction that you're traveling. So the local electron only interacts with other distant matter when that distant matter is also looking back at it. So it's a coupling together of electrons that have equal and opposite velocities. So the electron kind of sorts out and selects only some of the particles in the distant universe. Next slide, please. So this means that electrons really kind of interact with these little spikes of energy that are very short and sharp that interact. Next slide, please. So that our quantum picture, which says that all light is really a wave packet, a wavy, smooth, oscillating packet of energy, that this picture is really one level lower. It's a deeper level that says that if we could look below the quantum level to a deeper level of reality, we'd see the tiny little, very short, sharp spikes of energy of electrons as they connect with each other across the universe. Next slide. The key idea, the basic idea in the synchronized universe model is that when you put all these ideas together, the local electron interacts only with distant matter, which happens to have a velocity looking right back at it at that moment, so that at one instant the electron will be aiming in a certain direction. Here we have a picture showing a central electron, and it'll end up going around in a little circle as it at one moment, it'll be heading in a certain direction, and at that moment, it'll interact with the top electron here in the picture. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm making this too complicated, and I apologize. It's in the book. The bottom line is that where our present science says a particle is just sitting still, that if you look at a deeper level, it's not. It's really zipping around in a tiny little orbit, a tiny little circle, and as it goes around in that little orbit, at any given moment, its velocity is in a certain direction. And as its velocity points in that direction, it will interact with matter in that direction that it's heading. At a moment later, in its little orbit, it'll be pointing off in a different direction. At that moment, it'll be able to interact with matter in the far distant universe that's looking back at it from that direction. So it kind of couples with the distant matter, but only sort of one particle at a time, and it kind of sweeps out a circle as it interacts. So what this means is that there's a phase synchronization, that these things become phase locked together, so that the orbit of the local particle and the orbits of distant particles all become locked together, so they all oscillate together. So only the ones that are in phase with each other, only the ones that are aiming in just the right direction at just the right times will see each other and interact with each other. And those are the ones that will say, yes, you're in my universe because I interact with you. I feel a force from you, so I interact. All the other particles that are in some other phase, some other state of motion, where they're in the wrong direction or the wrong angle or the wrong moment, will not interact. And those will be invisible to these electrons. So there's a coupling together. Next slide, please. This idea that if you just leave these little rapidly moving electrons in this condition, there's a natural coupling of phases that will occur, and this is a well-established principle in physics. Next slide, please. A moment later in the picture, the electron's velocity has shifted around a little bit as he goes around in his little orbit, and now he's off in a different direction. He couples with a different electron. Next slide, please. What this leads to is that one set of electrons will all become coupled together, and they will see each other, but nothing else. So that becomes one universe, one of what we call a physical universe. They interact with the forces that we know and love in our present science. You can have many, many other parallel systems in other phases or other frequencies that do not see our universe, but they see their own universe. So it becomes like a stack of pieces of paper, where if you're on one sheet of paper, you interact with the other particles on that piece of paper, but the other nearby, adjacent sheets of paper are totally invisible to you. So this becomes a model for parallel universes. It's a very natural model. Next slide, please. The idea is like when you have a fan rotating, and you take a strobe light and you flash the strobe light on the fan. If you flash the strobe at just the right frequency, you can freeze those blades of the fan and make them appear to be stationary and make them appear to be solid. If you change so that's kind of like being in our universe. If you change the frequency of the strobe so it does not match the fan blades disappear. And that would be like other universes, parallel systems. Now you can change your strobe to a different frequency, and now you can see that fan. Next slide, please. So in this model, you could have parallel universes, each of which is perfectly happy and thinks that they're the only one that's present, and they can be right in the same physical space. Next slide, please. In this model, the idea for paranormal phenomena, which is probably the key to UFO technology, is when you get synchronization across multiple sheets of paper. If you can create effects that couple the motions in more than one sheet of paper, that's what paranormal phenomena are. These phenomena would appear transitory in any one sheet of paper, but they exist across many sheets of paper, and it probably explains why one of the best ways of testing paranormal phenomena is with random event generators. The quantum noise gets altered when paranormal phenomena occur, and that's because these adjacent sheets of paper are coupled together. They start to move together, and so the quantum noise decreases. Next slide, please. The idea there is similar to what was described in Flatland by Abbott years ago, that if you have a two-dimensional life form like Flatland, and the Flatlanders are very happy and they think they understand things until one day a higher dimensional being, a sphere, intrudes. And initially, when it makes contact with Flatland, it's only at a point. But a moment later, as the sphere passes into Flatland, now it becomes a circle. From their point of view, this is an anomalous phenomenon, and they can't explain it. But from our point of view, and a higher perspective, it's very easy to understand. And I think this is the analog of what I just showed you for the paranormal phenomena. Next slide, please. If you take this model and try to connect it with our present science, we find that it explains a whole lot of what we call our present-day quantum mechanics. It begins to make sense of the quantum frequencies and things like that. Next slide, please. So the model explains a lot of the phenomena that our present science has seen, in addition to a number of the phenomena that we don't understand today in the paranormal area. Next slide, please. So there are really four basic ideas that are kind of pulled together to make this model. Number one is that particles couple across great distances. Number two is that the synchronized phase-locked motions result from that. Number three is that these oscillating systems separate into layers. And the fourth is this four-dimensional hologram idea, which I haven't described yet. Next slide, please. The hologram is based on the idea that all matter is absorbing radiation from far away and also has to radiate it back into the distant matter. So there's a constant interchange of radiation between the local particle and things that are far away. Next slide, please. What this creates, this is a basic drawing of a hologram. The basic idea for a hologram is you have a plate which has little lines on the plate. When you pass a light through the plate, the light scatters on the lines, and then at some distant point the light adds up and makes a picture. Next slide, please. This just shows the same idea. The holographic plate is the key point to how a coherent light from a laser scattering off that pattern of lines will reinforce at some other location to make an image, here in this case a cube. Next slide, please. We know from brain research that there's a number of ways that the brain acts like a holographic receiver. And Michael Talbot's Holographic Universe gave a beautiful description of how this might be a good model for consciousness. Next slide, please. In the Synchronized Universe model, which I'm describing here, it's that distant matter of the universe that acts like the holographic plate. It's the motions of that distant matter which scatters the radiation from nearby and then backwards in time to refocus again to make an image. Next slide, please. So if we could look out at how the distant matter reacts to radiation from nearby objects, we'd see little ripples that would be created by the radiation, and those ripples then affect how things come back and reform and refocus. Next slide, please. Except that now, because in the four-dimensional idea that I've described here, the future matter and the past matter are both contributing. Next slide, please. So that if you can think about the hologram just as a normal hologram, except with the additional wrinkle that the matter in the past and the matter in the future are both contributing to making whatever we see as our present object. Next slide, please. Consciousness is also described in the same way, that our brain waves, all our thought patterns, thought balls, whatever is in our mind as a energized thought is probably also creating ripples of energy, ripples of information on the motions of matter, both in the past and in the present. Next slide, please. It turns out the DNA is an ideal molecule for allowing us to couple into the system. DNA is a double helix. It's ideal for creating what are called phase-conjugated photons, which should be able to couple and create images in the past and in the future matter. Next slide, please. So in this picture, ESP and psychokinesis occurs when we send ideas, thoughts into the future and into the past, and they reflect and refocus to create images. Next slide, please. The difference between a four-dimensional hologram and a conventional hologram is that a 4D hologram may well have a substance to it. It may have a force to it and act like real matter, not just the light that we pass our hands through in a conventional hologram. Next slide, please. This may be the key to how to materialize objects, how to teleport objects. Motion may be just a shift. I think we shift over. Could we go back one, please? Can you go back? I think you went over a couple, didn't you? Okay, I'm sorry. Go forward. Slide. Next slide. One of the interesting things about this idea is that when you imagine that matter is maintained and stabilized in this way, then you can create thought forms and you can create influences that refocus in the past or in the future or in the present, and you can create them so that they refocus at very far distances away from us, just as easily as nearby. So this idea leads you to an explanation for how psychic phenomena can sort of transcend space and time. Next slide, please. Hyperdrive and warp jumps. A lot of the anomalous transportation is seen in UFO phenomena, where craft just seem to be able to disappear, or they are able to travel faster than light, can be explained in the same way. If a craft creates an image of itself in the future and in the past, and it gives it those images phase shifts, so that when those images reconverge again, they don't refocus at the present point, but at some other location in space and time. The object can teleport. It can disappear at one place and jump and reform at another location. So the model leads to a natural explanation of how these hyperjumps might occur. Next slide, please. The same idea of causing how ripples in the distant matter, vibrations in the distant matter, that are key to all these forms, helps understand sacred geometry, because certain geometrical shapes will create resonances with the distant matter that will have special properties, and that's a whole other subject, but the key to it is here. Next slide, please. So it's only a beginning. I have a website, synchronizeduniverse.com, and that's it for right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. That was intense. Is there going to be a test now?
Pop quiz.
Pop quiz. Actually, we'd like to invite you up to the microphone over to our right here for questions and answers. We do have about 10-15 minutes or so. We ask that you do state it in form of a question.
Boy, where do you begin to question after a talk like that? That was terrific. I think one of the interesting things that I came across in my history of research was the raw material, which was material that was discovered essentially by a scientist, and his name was Don Elkins, and he questioned this intelligence. And one of the things I think that they talk about in there is similar to what you're expanding upon, and what the medium or the ethers that connect all of that might be congruent with is love. What they talked about is love. So the energy that connects all that is love, and what we think about and how we create both in the past and in the forward and interact with this illusion, as they call it, that's the current now moment, if you're following me, is something that's pulled together by that love. So I just wanted to bring that about, because it's something that in our current time we're having difficulty with our politics with one another, not just internationally but locally, and it might be something that we can actually think about further. I'm currently reading The Isaiah Effect, which is Greg Braden's book, and he's talking about rediscovering prayer and prophecy in there, and how the ancients used just that, the use of consciousness and love in both the past and the present, and the knowledge about how to use that in order to bring about change. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but I just wanted to add that and contribute that to your talk.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things, I did not talk much about prophecy, but it's a very interesting area. Obviously, if you can move in space and time, then prophecy should be possible. One of the big puzzles for me for a long, long time is if prophecy is possible, then where's free will? You know, and how do we reconcile those two? And I've come to a way to reconcile them that feels comfortable for me, in terms of sort of that the universe has more than one possibility. Maybe we have sort of one most likely timeline right now, but with prayer, with action, with love, with effort, we can shift those timelines, so we're not just doomed to go down one particular timeline. We have some degree to affect our future, and in fact, there's some circumstantial evidence that maybe we're living on a timeline right now that was not one we were originally scheduled to go down. Maybe things have already been changed, and that's why we didn't go through some of the destructive millennial events that were prophesied. So, it's a very interesting effect, and I certainly agree with you about love. That's one of the. I described a little bit about the near-death experiences, which is one way we learn about the other side and about the soul. And the universal message that comes back from the near-death experiencers is how important love is. That it's almost it is the most important thing. So this physical reality may be Maya, it may be illusion, but one of the things we're learning here is the importance of love. I believe that too. Next question, please. Yeah.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned Uri Geller. A few weeks ago, he was a guest with George Norrie on Coast to Coast AM, and he basically went through his life history, and of course he's still active. And a couple of things he mentioned on going through the program. He was in a helicopter over the England-Scotland soccer match, and he made the ball move on a penalty kick for Scotland, and of course the kick went awry. And also they were conducting an experiment where you could put your clock or watch next to the radio, and you could make a broken watch begin. Have you met Uri Geller in person?
No, I would love to. I've never met him in person. I corresponded with him to get permission to use some of his photographs in my book. So I have a very brief correspondence with him, and that's about it. But I knew Eldon Bird fairly well. Eldon was a friend of Uri's, and I know about some of the. They were both involved in lawsuits against Randy, the magician. So I know secondhand, and I know Hal Puthoff well. Hal Puthoff has been involved with doing research on Geller and confirmed that he's the real deal. He's the things he did in Puthoff's experiments you could not explain any other way. But I've never met him.
And secondly, are you familiar with the book The Nature of Reality, as channeled from Hilarion by Maurice Cook?
I've seen the title. I've never read it. I have not read it.
Where they go into you mentioned electrons and the nature of matter and space-time. It was originally channeled in 1977 and I think updated in 1990. It's still available, though, at a New Age bookstore.
Yeah, thank you. I know there's a lot of good material that is channeled out there. I'm just always very skeptical, very leery. I guess I'm just kind of very careful because I never know until it's always hard for me to be sure about channel material unless you really know the channeler and know about the circumstances of it. I know, like the Seth material, I have a sister who's been trying to get me to read it for years, and she says it's one of her highest compliments that my descriptions of reality have come closer to Seth over the years. So I'm sort of approaching Seth as I get older. So I must be, but I'm sort of doing it my own way. But I do respect that material. Yeah.
Yeah, this was channeled during a yoga experiment where he focused on a point in the center of his head, and all this information just came to him.
Yeah.
So,
I will tell you that, as you probably know, I mean, a lot of the great discoveries in physics have come from paranormal circumstances. I mean, Niels Bohr came up with his model of the atom from a dream, for example. And whenever I get stuck on a physics problem, I meditate and wait for the answer to appear. So,
yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I was a little puzzled by the exactly how the quantum noise was affected by the OJ verdict. Could you describe quantum noise a little bit more in detail and exactly a little bit elucidate how that actually happened?
Yes. In my picture of the quantum noise, we have the whole system divides up into these synchronized sheets. Okay. And we live on one sheet. We call that our physical reality. In this picture, the nearby sheets are not synchronized with us, but they will react. They will interact with us, but it's only in a random kind of way. And therefore, they would be the quantum noise. So it's our interaction with these nearby adjacent universes in this picture that make up what we call the quantum noise, the uncertainty principle. If we synchronize or partially synchronize with those adjacent sheets, then the random interactions will decrease. And therefore the quantum noise, as we call it, would decrease as those adjacent universes become more synchronized with us. So that's the basic idea behind this picture.
Okay, so in the case of the OJ verdict and the audience, for instance, how did that actually affect the random event generators?
Because our consciousness somehow, our consciousness basically is a paranormal effect. Therefore, a consciousness, when many, many minds focus on the same thought, that would bring these other adjacent systems more into sync with our own. Okay, so it would cause more correlation of other parallel universes, and therefore the random interactions between them would decrease.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Has everyone else had a chance to ask, or let the others ask?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Certainly.
I had a friend who had so many OBE experiences that he told this other friend who we often appeared to that be sure and weigh him when he showed up. And he weighed about 170 pounds normally, and I think he said he got weighed this time and he was like 96 pounds. And he figured if he could get up to full weight, then he wouldn't have to go back. So, but anyway, and he had another friend, by the way, who he appeared to so often that she thought that was the way people sort of appear. But anyway.
Is he still around? I'd like to
No,
meet him.
no,
Okay, that's too
no,
bad.
Unfortunately.
Okay.
My real question is, do you have any experiment in mind, or have you devised any to prove your theory of the 4D hologram and all that stuff?
I haven't thought that far ahead. Right now, my next step really is to pull together some of the math so that it becomes a coherent theory. Right now, what I've shown are pictures, and there is a little bit of math to connect some of the pieces, but really to present this in a rigorous way in a scientific community, it's got to be put together end to end with the supporting math, and that's what I'm working on right now. So I haven't really thought the next step beyond that of trying to finding key experiments that would prove it. However, I mean, clearly there are some ideas that are kind of obvious from the description about how you might try to be able to shift into parallel realities by changing your frequency, if you can do it by enough. But that's about it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello. I would like to find out if you have ever spoken at any conferences, or if conferences exist that examine consciousness at this level, and if if there could be a conference created, maybe that would bring mystics and people studying this phenomenon on the stage in front of a bunch of physicists who are forced to listen to them and see if they can come together. Because it seems that, these worlds of the whole lecture circuit and stuff are very separate. And I was wondering, are there any conferences we don't know about that might be interesting to scientists?
Well, it's a good question. I belong to a group called the Society for Scientific Exploration, which is kind of a group of more or less hard scientists who study psychic phenomena and things like this. So they study the things that typically don't fit into the mainstream conferences. And so the Princeton Paralab people, for example, are some of the founders of that organization. So the SSE, or the Society for Scientific Exploration, is one. That typically you find in those groups that you have factions that each have their own interest, and even there they worry, they start to break down, and there's a limit to how much they can take of somebody else's ideas. But it's the best one I can think of. There are conferences like the one in Tucson every couple of years that should also be a good forum. But I think we need something better. I think we do.
I was wondering if you had heard anything about Marie Bauer Hall's work, wife of Manly P. Hall. She'd said that there was though there was an organized intelligence and energy source at a source level, causal, that there was also a secondary intelligence, which she called the mind of nature, which permeated the atoms and electrons and all that, and sort of like a mind for nature, so that the source could communicate through, because in the beginning was primordial matter. So I was curious, what do you think of that secondary intelligence source? And also, by the way, she also mentioned something about the soul mind. Actually, that we had both a physical mind, which was the natural mind, which was locked into our physical forms, and a spirit mind, which had to do with the spirit of us, and then the soul mind, and that all three worked on uniquely different ways.
Yeah, I know a little bit about Marie Bauer Hall, more about the Bacon Vault and her whole interest with that whole area. I was involved in some excavations there. I don't know much about what she said about the soul mind, etc. I do know Arthur Powell's work, theosophist, who pulled together a lot of the knowledge from various psychic sources about the different levels of different forms, if you like, of soul energy, or the causal and the mental and all that. And the third book in my this is the first book in my series.
Right.
I've got 4 more that are all kind of half written and all kind of underway. The third one is going to focus more on the soul.
Oh, good.
But it's an area that we don't know much about. I mean, at least I don't, and I'm sort of struggling. So I'd like to follow up with some of her material.
Yeah, it was basically buried there afterward. And it's fascinating because, have you ever seen her diagrams?
No.
Because that's the most important thing to see, because she actually drew, it's like the fabric of nature that underlines nature. It's like patterns. And those underlying patterns, she said, were lines of life and light. And that the lines of life were basically what animates us and animates form. And that the lines of light were intelligence that ran through that form. And I was wondering if science ever picked up on, say, the warmth or magnetic factors and the electric cold factors of intelligence, if they have ever delved into that.
Never did.
Not yet? Oh, Marie
Not
did
yet.
in 1940.
But maybe we'll get there.
1939.
I'd like to just, speaking about the soul, I mean,
Yes.
I feel like I'm pretty ignorant. I mean, with the ancients, I mean, in some groups, clearly they've mastered. They know so much more than we do. One of the adept yogis of India, Sri Yukteswar, who I gave a quote earlier, after he died, he came back to Yogananda, his student, and he described what life on the other side was like and what he was doing now. And he was working, I think it was in the astral plane, teaching them about the causal, the next level up, and he would go between levels, just like you were taking a bus downtown or something, very easy. But he had such a deep understanding of these higher levels, and so, I'd like to.
Well, I had the fortunate I was had spoken on, gosh, I don't know if you remember, way back there was another radio show before Art Bell's, and it was called Open Mind. And I was fortunate to speak with Bob Monroe before he had passed on, and I was very fond of him. And I'd been going out of body since 9 years old. So
Wow.
we got to talking, and one of the things that we both had done was that when you first leave, if you're going to go back into the past, your body actually spins. You actually leave the body and do some spinning, and then all of a sudden you do move back into the past, or the forward spin would be moving toward the forward.
That's
so
really
I found that
interesting.
through time and everything. Anyway,
That's
I didn't mean
interesting.
to monopolize time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I hope to talk to you.
Okay,
later.
great.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm going to ask a quick question, then sit down.
Okay.
I find the concept of zero-point energy very intriguing. Do you think that it can lead to cold fusion and ultimately to faster than light travel?
Yes. Elaborate. Yeah, I think a lot of what I was talking about today in terms of the paranormal is a beginning of understanding zero-point energy. That the picture that some people have of it, that it's just kind of photons flying around in empty space, which is a step forward, still does not begin to describe the complexity, that there could be very many complex energy forms present in the vacuum, in the zero-point energy. And it's these complex energy forms that allow prana to exist, that allow the higher consciousness to exist, so that I think that the answer is yes to your question, that yes, we can exploit it, that the charge clusters and the cold fusion and the kawaii generator that I showed are all pulling energy out of the vacuum in different ways to make it useful, and we're just scratching the surface of that whole subject. But I think the paranormal is also one more area where the zero-point energy is coming into play. Next question, yeah.
I don't know whether you can see it or not. I'm wearing what was told was a Merkaba, which was your sacred geometry.
Yes, yeah.
Are you familiar with kinesiology?
A little bit, yes,
I found with this, and was tested, that when I don't wear this, my body is weakened when I'm around television, cell phones, microwave. And with this, when I wear it, my body is strong. Can you explain how that works?
Not in detail, no. I mean, the basic...
Why is this called sacred geometry as opposed to other geometry?
The little sketch I showed was that certain geometrical forms that have regular shapes to them will excite certain vibrations of distant matter, okay? Then those vibrations then also radiate back energy to us, okay? If the patterns they radiate back reinforce the patterns that we already have here, then things become more stable. We become more able to withstand upsetting, disturbances, etc. So that I think certain energy forms that have this quality of resonance are the most beneficial to us, and the regular geometrical shapes like the triangle and tetrahedron are certainly, among those. So that's just kind of like, that's about as much as I understand right now. This whole idea is at the basis of astrology too. This is why astrology actually works, and there's studies that have been done that show that certain astrological patterns really do affect physics, even though physicists have no idea how to begin to explain it. But I think the answer lies in these geometrical patterns of vibration of the distant matter, and how, because that's another aspect of subtle energy, that really each different pattern probably is coupling into a certain form of subtle energy. So that's my explanation for right now.
Thank you.
You're
It's
welcome.
more than I know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello. I was just wondering, do you know if the Catholic Church uses people such as your background in addition to the priests when they investigate cases of demon possession or cases of miracles in relation to saints that, they're investigating for canonization?
I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about canonization. All I really do, I looked into two cases where like the two levitators, Teresa of Avila and Brother Joseph, and those were cases of canonization where the Catholic Church wanted to, verify were they real or not, and so they took some high official who would be in charge of the investigation. He would interview all the people who had seen them. But that's about all. I don't know much about canonization beyond that, so I don't know if they ever have any scientists involved. Unfortunately, for most scientists, they would just say, "Well, it's impossible, so it didn't happen." So that was the easy investigation. So, I don't know much about that. Yeah. Hi.
So, why does astrology work?
Well, the short answer, which is about all I have right now, is the picture I showed on the sacred geometry. In other words, it's the idea that when matter has certain patterns, certain geometrical shapes, then the energy that we reflect out, that we send away from us just in our normal interaction, our normal activities, because all physical processes involve radiation and absorption of energy. So when the distant matter has certain geometrical shapes to it, then it reflects back in the same pattern that was sent out, and that makes those patterns more stable. So that's the basic idea.
So the person who's born at a given time, they're the sort of reflection plate in which these subtle energies are manifested, so some sort of crystallization, so to speak?
Yeah, I think so. Again.
I know I took you a bit afield on this. So.
Well, this is stuff that I think is really important, and our science has to address it. Mm-hmm. Any phenomenon that we can show is real, that really works, at least even to some extent, our science needs to be able to understand how it happens. Mm-hmm. I think that as we learn more about subtle energy, most people who study subtle energy say that it's not just one kind of prana, there's many different kinds of prana, different colors of prana, and probably they correspond to the different geometrical shapes, the regular polygons of different geometrical shapes that probably correspond to different vibration modes of distant matter. So,
I thought two illustrations you did tonight are the Foucault pendulum with the moon and sun are conjunct, causing a subtle energy spike that wasn't expected and not known about. Mm-hmm. And then also when you were talking, I think, about Orion being overhead, or Orion and something else, I think.
Right.
And that created heightened psychic manifestations.
Yes.
So anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Swanson, could you give us some of your feelings or insights on crop circles?
Sure. I saw the Terence Meaden stuff earlier when I first came in. I went over into the crop circles in the summer of '99. I got myself there by probably fooling myself. I convinced myself that I needed to go there because the physics I was trying to work with involves higher dimensional geometry, and I was having trouble visualizing it. And the crop circles were supposed to be very higher dimensional shapes that summer, and so I thought if I go and look at them, I'll be able to get better imagination, better intuition on higher dimensions. I'd always wanted to go to see them, but that was my rationale. When I got there, I found a lot of things I didn't expect. I don't consider myself, as I've said, terribly psychic, but I found that. Well, the first day we went into the crop circles, I was told just go to 3. Don't go to more than 3, because the energies, the subtle energies, will just totally upset your system, and you won't be able to handle more. And I said, well, I'm pretty invulnerable. I'm pretty insensitive. I'll take as many as you'll drive me to, And on the 4th one, I realized that in my mind I was still on the 3rd one. I couldn't get past it. The 3rd one was the Hackpen Circle, which was very powerful that year, and I could actually feel a physical force pushing me around the circle. And so on the 4th one I was still back in the Hackpen Circle. And so that was sort of like my first introduction to the real force that's present in the circles. By the longer I was there, the more sensitive I became to subtle energy. There was one called the Liddington Castle Formation that summer. It was a cloudy day. It had been raining for several days, and I stood in the circle. When I closed my eyes, I could have sworn that I was at a certain temple in Egypt. near Luxor. I would have sworn that's where I was. And I would also swear that the sun had come out while I had my eyes closed. I opened my eyes again, and no, it was just as cloudy and just as rainy as before. So there was something about that circle that captured something about that location in Egypt. Another circle called the Devil's Den Circle, that after I was there, we were there for several hours, I could begin to see, well, the first thing I saw was there was a little vortex at the tip of each star point around the circle. And when I looked at the thing and just stared at it, I began to see a grayish mist blowing across it. And I figured, well, it must have gotten foggy while I was standing here, you know. Then I looked up, and no, it was a clear, bright, sunny day. There was nothing had changed. I looked back, and I could see this. And so I think this is what people call etheric energy, you know. And so the longer I was in the circles, the more I seemed to become attuned to it. So my conclusion is that, you know, whether we say that they're created by people or not, and a lot of them probably are created by people, but maybe they have help, because a lot of the people who actually make the circles, who call the crop circlers, they describe these little orbs that appear while they're making them. There's a group that they'll go to the pub halfway through the circle, and go to the pub and have a pint of ale and come back and the circle's finished, you know, or they come back the next morning and they find that new things have been added to it, you know, while they were in bed. And orbs are frequently seen around circles. So it's a fascinating interplay between us humans and something else.
I have a question regarding the Montauk series of books by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon. The first one was Montauk, An Experiment in Time, which connected the 1983 activity at Montauk with the Philadelphia experiment of 1943, resulting in a 40-year crack in hyperspace. Now, the second book was entitled Montauk Revisited. The blurb beneath the title said, "Go beyond science, explore the occult principles behind the creation of this time zone." It also involved mind control and psychic research. Can you do you have any further information on those books?
No, I don't. I've heard Preston Nichols on the radio. I mean, some of the things he said seemed plausible, others didn't. The whole Philadelphia experiment I'm pretty skeptical about. If I knew how to do time travel, I wouldn't pick a destroyer as the craft to do it in. It's just too complex. It's not a regular shape. I'd pick a nice, simple, like a lens-shaped circular object, you know, like a saucer. I mean, that would be a good shape. If something's nice and simple, if you want to create these very high fields that are supposed to have been involved, I would not pick a destroyer. So to me, it doesn't make a whole lot of, it doesn't seem logical that they would have been done the way it's described. So I'm pretty skeptical myself.
Do you know Al Bielek?
I've seen him at a conference or two, but you know, that's about it.
Well, he was on the George Norrie Coast to Coast AM show in July of last year.
Yeah.
And he predicted there would be a power failure on the East Coast 2 weeks before it happened, approximately August 12th or August 14th, on the 60th anniversary of the Philadelphia experiment. And it actually happened for about 24 hours from Ohio to New York and
that's interesting. Yeah.
Canadian border.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
This will be our last question.
Okay.
Dr. Swanson, before I ask my question, I just wanted to let you know that your presentation was really superb, the way you laid it out for common people like myself.
Thank you.
In any event, are you familiar with Dr. Tom Bearden?
Yes.
And his work? Okay. I believe in his book, Energy from the Vacuum, he's constantly using the term rigorous science, rigorous proofs. And my question is perhaps somewhat political, but from your personal experience, if the proof is so rigorous, which I believe it is, and the ability to disseminate the information is not being hampered, then how can traditional science, in the face of hardware, in the face of the math, in the face of all that's there, continue to deny that this is a viable science? And also from your own personal experience with so-called traditional scientists. So my question is, are they really sincere in their denial, or is their denial coming from another place, if you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, and it's a little bit complicated.
Yeah, I realize the question.
I think most scientists who deny it, believe that they're right, and part of it is that they never see the information to the contrary, that the journals don't allow such material to be published.
Don't allow.
That's right, because the people who run the journals think it must not be right, it must be wrong, therefore we're not going to publish it, and therefore the contradicting evidence never really gets published. Also, the funding apparatus for research is run by the establishment scientists who believe things in a certain way, and therefore they won't fund research that they think is impossible. So that goes on, I believe. So the part of it is just the inertia of having a certain mindset, that you filter out anything to the contrary. So that is part of it. At the same time, there are also interests involved. The military obviously does not, if it's a technology that they think would be valuable for weapons, or very sensitive, like the atomic bomb would be the prime example, they're not allowed to be published. It'll be tucked away somewhere and kept secret. A lot of this stuff might be of equal or greater value than that. So therefore, they'd like to have it done, but have it done behind walls of secrecy somewhere. So that's part of it. Another part is the commercial part. Like the oil companies are very powerful. They don't want free energy out there, So you have these vested interests that have a lot of power that may also kind of not want this stuff to get done. So I think it's a little of both, probably.
Very quickly, you said that the publishers won't allow it because they dismiss it, more or less.
In other words, scientific journals have editors that are scientists.
Right.
And they are educated in the conventional scientific paradigm. They believe, just as strongly as I used to believe, that all this stuff must be a hoax, because it violates the textbooks that I grew up on.
I understand what you're saying, but my question is it perhaps that they have looked it over and realized that it is viable, and that's why they don't publish it, not because they think it isn't viable, but because they think it is viable?
It's possible that there's some like that, or maybe they're just being told by some authority, don't publish this stuff. It's possible.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's give a warm hand for Dr. Swanson. He'll be available to sign books in the back. Please check out his book. And thanks again, Dr. Swanson, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.